It wasn't supposed to be like this. When Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, it was supposed to be a quick smash and grab. His troops would storm through the country and take Ukraine, leaving him with a huge chunk of new Russian territory. And it almost worked. During the early days of the invasion, Russian troops managed to get to the outskirts of Kyiv before being pushed back out of the city. Then came the near-unanimous support for Ukraine from major Western powers. Suddenly, Putin found himself with a war on his hands. A war that is well past the 2-year point at the time of creating this video. The smash and grab has turned into a war of attrition, and you may think that Russia is perfectly suited for that kind of war. It has the second most powerful military in the world, and it can keep throwing soldiers and equipment at Ukraine until Kyiv finally has to surrender to the might of Putin. But is that really the case? Far from having a never-ending supply of equipment and soldiers to maintain its war, Russia finds itself on the brink of being the victim of the atrophy this war has created. Simply put, it's running out of everything. If Ukraine can hold on for just a little while longer, it may soon find itself fighting a toothless Russia that isn't even able to support the troops it has in the country. How is that even possible? To explain, we'll start with one of the main pieces of equipment Russia has used in its invasion: tanks. On paper, Russia is a tank behemoth. According to Global Firepower, which releases annual rankings of 145 military nations in order of their strength in an array of departments, no other country has more tanks than Russia. It's believed to have a stock of 14,777, with 10,344 of those tanks being combat-ready. Naturally, you might assume that would mean that it can keep driving more and more tanks into Ukraine, no matter how many the Ukrainians have taken out. That's until you start to look into the numbers. In April 2024, Forbes examined the state of Russia's army and how long it will be capable of sustaining its offensive. When looking at the country's tanks, it makes the important note that Russia is capable of producing around 500 to 600 new tanks annually, which it's using to replace the tanks it's losing in Ukraine. The problem is that it's losing tanks at a higher rate than it's replacing them. In February 2024, just before the war's 2-year point, Reuters published an article claiming that Russia had lost more than 3,000 tanks in Ukraine. That was equal to the country's entire pre-war active inventory. Plus, basic math shows us that losing 3,000 tanks in 2 years means that Russia is losing 1,500 tanks annually, yet it's only producing between 500 and 600, around a third of the amount it's losing. It's an unsustainable system, as well as one that's led to Russia having to rely on far less conventional methods of transporting its troops, methods like having them drive around in golf carts. A May 2024 article published in Forbes claims that 2023 saw Russia acquire around 2,100 Desert Cross 1003 all-terrain vehicles from a Chinese company. Though the name of this vehicle may sound impressive, the reality is that the Desert Cross 1003 is little more than a heavy-duty golf cart. It's compact, offers practically no protection to the people driving in it, and shockingly, it's been finding its way to the front lines. That's not the way these vehicles are intended to be used. It's entirely possible to see the Desert Cross 1003 serving as a useful runaround vehicle behind the war's front lines. It can be used to transfer troops and equipment between stations, meaning the purchase has a practical purpose. However, Forbes reports that Russia's troops are so starved of vehicles that they've taken to riding the Desert Cross 1003 into battle. The Desert Cross 1003 isn't suitable for the front lines. The vehicle weighs just 1.5 tons and has an 85 horsepower engine, with no heavy armaments or armor to protect the crew inside. For those reasons, it becomes easy pickings for Ukraine and its drones. Several reports suggest that Russians riding these golf carts have been shredded by drone fire. One such incident saw the Drone Strikes Company, typically a support branch for Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade, spot a team of 7 Russian soldiers riding a Desert Cross 1003. After briefly monitoring the Russians from the air, the Strike Drones company concluded they'd be able to do little to defend themselves from a drone attack, so it launched one. All 7 Russian infantrymen were killed in the attack, and worse yet for Putin, the entire thing was recorded as it happened by the drones before being uploaded onto the Telegram social media network. But let's come back to tank numbers. Though Russia is only building enough tanks to replace about a third of its inventory annually, it's still able to send more tanks into Ukraine. That's according to Henry Boyd, who's the Senior Fellow for Military Capability at the International Institute for Strategic Services. He estimates that Russia managed to put between 1,000 and 1,500 tanks into service between February 2023 and 24, which would be enough to replace the tanks it's already lost. The problem? The vast majority of those tanks are older models that are extremely vulnerable to Ukrainian anti-tank defenses such as the Javelin system. The situation is so bad, according to Boyd, that only 200 of the tanks Russia sent to Ukraine during that period were new models. The rest were refurbished tanks, some dating back to the early post-World War II era of the Soviet Union. Moscow has been able to trade quality for quantity, Boyd claims, going on to point out that it could likely sustain another 3 years of heavy tank losses by relying on and refurbishing its older inventory. However, the longer Russia relies on these older tanks, the heavier those losses may become. After all, Ukraine has the ability to take out tanks en masse. It's proven that already. Sending older tanks in after new ones is simply a recipe for the country to be able to destroy more of Russia's inventory. That may be why we're seeing some Russian troops resorting to driving unarmored golf carts around Ukraine. Their tanks are being destroyed at such a rapid rate that there simply aren't enough to go around on the front line that stretches for around 600 miles. Still, perhaps it's not quite accurate to say that Russia is running out of tanks. It still has plenty of Soviet-era tanks, such as T-60s, in its stockpile. Instead, it's more accurate to say that Russia is running out of modern tanks that can actually be effective on the battlefield, forcing it to rely on older and outdated models that are becoming increasingly easy pickings for Ukraine. Of course, having to dig deep into these stockpiles also creates a problem for Russia in the future. If it wins the war in Ukraine and then decides to turn its attention to another country, such as Macedonia, it will need to spend years replenishing its tank supplies before it can launch another assault in the same vein as the one it's launched in Ukraine. We see a similar situation with Russia's armored vehicles. According to the IISS, Russia lost more than 3,000 armored fighting vehicles between February 2023 and February 2024, bringing its total losses during the war up to 8,800. That means it's losing vehicles at a rate of around 4,400 annually, leading to an even higher attrition rate than it's seeing with its tanks. On the surface, this should be a problem for Russia, at least if figures produced by London's Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, are to be believed. It points out that Russia is creating around 4,500 armored vehicles per year, which is just about enough to make good on the losses it's experiencing on the Ukrainian front lines. A pair of RUSI analysts, Nick Reynolds and Jack Watling, even point out that this rate of armored vehicle manufacture has the Kremlin believing that it can sustain the current rate of attrition through 2025. But there's a catch. Much like Russia's tanks, the supposedly new armored vehicles being sent into Ukraine aren't new at all. The RUSI estimates that around 80% of them are simply older armored vehicles, many again dating back to the Soviet era, that have simply been given a quick refurbishment and modernization before being pushed out onto the front lines. That approach is working right now. Enough of Russia's older vehicles are in good enough states of repair that they can be quickly turned around and sent to Ukraine. The problem will come as the war moves deeper into 2024, as the RUSI analysts point out. The number of systems held in storage means that while Russia can maintain a consistent output through 2024, it will begin to find that vehicles require deeper refurbishment through 2025. In other words, burning through Cold War-era stock can only get Russia so far, with its heavy vehicle losses forcing it to turn to older and older armored vehicles, all of which need much more work to bring them up to an acceptable standard than the ones the country is sending out now. Worst of all for Russia, according to the RUSI analysts, it will have exhausted most of its available armored vehicle stocks by 2026. RUSI isn't the only organization making this claim. In early 2024, the Estonian Defense Ministry also suggested that Russia is relying far too heavily on its old war stocks, preferring to refurbish what it already has rather than building new armored vehicles. The Estonian analysis examined satellite imagery to come up with rough numbers for the amounts of Russian armored vehicles that have been destroyed, are currently active, or are in storage. Their conclusion? The same as RUSI's. Russia's armored vehicle reserves will run dry at some point in 2025 or 26. The seemingly obvious solution to this problem is to build more armored vehicles. But it's here where Russia will see the sanctions placed against it by so many Western nations come to bear. Refurbishing an older vehicle requires a little metalwork, replacement of an engine, a modernization of a radio. In some cases, the vehicle may also see upgrades to its optics and armor, but that's hardly a given. The point is that Russia can minimize its use of resources to make those refurbished vehicles combat capable. Building from scratch is far more difficult. Not only does it require more materials, but Russia would also have to dedicate more labor to building new armored vehicles. It may be able to handle the latter issue, but when it comes to stockpiling what it needs, the Estonian Defense Ministry points out that significantly improving production quality under international sanctions is likely unrealistic even in the medium term. The problems Russia faces are threefold. It's going to increasingly struggle to get machine tools, high-quality components, and factory equipment if the sanctions against it remain in place. Of course, Putin has options. He could import these tools and components from China, though that option comes at the expense of quality, according to the Estonian analysts. And even that may be not as strong an option in mid-2024 as it was during the earlier months of the war. As Reuters reported in April 2024, the United States has repeatedly threatened to extend its sanctions on Russia to China. Beijing has taken that threat seriously. The country's biggest banks are now pulling back from financing transactions related to Russia, forcing many Chinese companies that still want to do business with Russia to go underground. Smaller banks that may be able to pass under the American radar, along with cryptocurrency, are becoming the go-to methods of receiving payments for these companies. But that in itself presents a problem for Russia. It means that the country can no longer make smooth transactions with China. It has to delay by using workarounds and unofficial channels. So even if Russia is able to build a stockpile of vehicle components and factory tools thanks to China, it's likely going to receive them at a slower rate than it would like. Plus, there are questions as to whether the required quality will be there when those parts arrive. The Estonian analysts say all of this adds to Russia likely being incapable of scaling up or expanding armored vehicle production beyond the levels it currently sits. RUSI agrees, with Reynolds and Watling writing in their report that this will necessarily mean a significant decrease in vehicles delivered to the military. A decrease that leads to situations like those where Russian troops are being forced to drive around in unprotected golf carts on the front lines. There is one caveat to Russia's armored vehicle conundrum. Ukraine has to keep the pace that it set during the first 2 years of the war. Destroying Russia's armored vehicles at a rate of around 4,500 per year will mean that it surpasses Russia's ability to bring more vehicles to the front lines. Ukraine simply needs to hold out, allowing the sanctions placed on Russia to force it to dig deeper into its mothballed stockpiles of armored vehicles as it struggles to manufacture new ones itself. Now let's switch the focus to people. In February 2024, CBC reported that a senior US Pentagon official claimed that Russia had lost 315,000 soldiers in the first 2 years of the war. For context, that's equivalent to the entire army that Russia sent to Ukraine, meaning Moscow has essentially needed to raise 2 armies for the war. It's perfectly capable of doing that. As Global Firepower reports, Russia has around 69.5 million people who could be part of its military, with 46.4 million fit for service and a further 1.275 million reaching military age every year. If that's the case, how could Russia possibly be running out of people for its war? Even with the loss of over 300,000, and the number may be closer to 400,000 if Ukraine's statistics are accurate, Russia has been both able to replace its lost ground troops and has more people it can send to the front lines when needed. But there are multiple issues at play here. The first is that many of Russia's soldiers simply don't want to be in Ukraine. In April 2024, AP News quoted the Russian media outlet Mediazona when it pointed out that there have been more than 7,300 cases of Russian soldiers going AWOL since the beginning of the war. That may not seem like a high number in the context of the 300,000 plus that were sent into Ukraine. That is until you realize that it represents a 6-fold increase in the number of deserters in the year before the war began. Other groups and countries are reporting record numbers too. For instance, Idite Lesom, roughly translated to Get Lost, is a group operated by Russian activists in Georgia. It exists to help soldiers who wish to desert disappear from Russian military scrutiny. It says that just 3% of the requests it received came from Russian soldiers seeking to leave the military in the spring of 2023. But by January 2024, that percentage had increased to around 30%, with the group receiving around 500 such requests during the first 2 months of 2024. Again, these numbers are small in the grand scheme of Russia's army, but they are indicative of a morale issue that could lead to even more Russian soldiers deserting as the war continues. Plus, even those who don't desert may still lack the morale needed to fight as well as they otherwise might, weakening Russia in the process. As for countries, they are encountering more and more Russians at their borders. The AP News report points out that the United States granted refugee status to fewer than 300 Russians in 2022. However, Customs and Border Patrol says that it encountered more than 57,000 Russians trying to enter the United States in 2023, 44,000 more than it encountered in 2021. France has seen a similar increase in Russian citizens seeking asylum or refugee status, with AP News noting a 50% increase in asylum requests between 2022 and 23. And the data from Germany is similar. It received 7,663 first-time asylum applications from Russian citizens in 2023, which is more than 3 times the amount it received in 2022. It's not known how many of these people are or were soldiers. Still, there's a clear trend of Russian citizens leaving their home country because they don't want to get dragged into a war that they clearly don't support. On a wider scale, the BBC estimates that anywhere between several hundred and several million Russians had left their homes by June 2023. Interestingly, this was a trend even before the Ukraine war started, with the BBC pointing out that many who disagreed with Putin's 2014 annexation of Crimea, along with recent laws that make it easier for Russia to punish dissent, have led to many leaving. Again, these numbers may not appear especially impressive in the context of Russia having many millions more people at military age, but as with the morale issue leading to desertions, they're indicative of a divided Russia. Even some within Russia, including those who've served in its military in the past, believe Moscow is coming close to running out of people. Speaking to GB News in early 2024, a former Russian commander named Igor Girkin claimed that Russia's army is light on numbers and that it's likely the country doesn't have any broad offensives planned for 2024 in light of this issue. Girkin would know. Now in a Russian prison under charges of extremism, he played a key role in helping Russia to annex Crimea in 2014. He believes that Russia finds itself at a point where it already needs to patch up holes in the ranks, and that Moscow will have practically no one to fight its war unless Putin mobilizes at least a portion of Russia's civilian population. There have already been signs of this increasing need to mobilize people outside of Russia's active military. In July 2023, Putin revealed plans to raise Russia's maximum mobilization age to 70, with the plans even going so far as to accept soldiers back into the army who have already been discharged. The plans would also call for Russia's reservists to serve until they're 60, meaning even those who've retired could be called back up. Junior officials find themselves in a similar position. They can still be called up until they're 60. These aren't the actions of a nation that has a steady supply of competent manpower with which to win a war. And competent may be the key word here. As Russia finds itself increasingly relying on new recruits to bolster its numbers, the training those recruits undergo could grow worse. According to Understanding War, a new Russian conscript should undergo between 1 and 2 months of basic training, which is followed up by anywhere between 3 and 6 months of advanced training before they arrive at their assigned units. Once in those units, the new recruits should be trained further with the help of veterans already serving on the front lines to hone their skills and get them ready for active combat. All told, a soldier shouldn't deploy with less than 4 months of training. Yet Understanding War pointed out in March 2022 that Russia engaged in the rapid deployment of fairly untrained reservists right from the beginning of the war. It also said that Russia's reservist and contract servicemen numbers, which are an impressive 2 million on paper, may not be ready for the fight either. Historically, just 10% of those reservists go through the refresher training before being sent back to war, leaving many operating on outdated or half-remembered training from years ago. The situation is so bad that RAND reported in 2019 that Russia actually only had around 5,000 troops who could be considered reserves in the Western sense, meaning they receive regular monthly and annual training, all of which leaves the many hundreds of thousands of reservists Russia claims to have weaker than they should be. The Moscow Times backs these claims up with the story of Ivan, an anonymous soldier on the front lines of Russia's offensive in July 2022. The 31-year-old Ivan told the newspaper he'd received just 5 days of training before he was sent to Ukraine. Others had it even worse. There was a soldier in our company who didn't know how a machine gun works. I wouldn't want to be next to him in the battle. How can you fight like that? How indeed. Sending soldiers into Ukraine with less than a week of training suggests Russia is less interested in developing capable soldiers and more interested in deploying cannon fodder. Perhaps this is part of the plan: send wave after wave of poorly trained soldiers to deplete Ukraine's resources. Whatever the case may be, Russia is finding itself in a position where it's running out of well-trained troops who are already on the front lines and is replacing them with poorly trained conscripts and reservists who likely shouldn't be on the front lines in the first place. Still, Russia has other approaches beyond sending untrained people to war on the ground, such as its vaunted air force, the VKS. Only the VKS hasn't proved even slightly effective in the war in Ukraine either, and it's on the verge of running out of planes and pilots. In a February 2024 report, the BBC repeated Ukraine's claims that it had shot down a stunning 342 Russian planes since the beginning of the war. It's taken out nearly as many helicopters, scuttling 325 choppers since February 2022. It's worth noting that these figures haven't been independently verified, and Russia hasn't commented on the supposed losses. Still, even if they're inflated, it's widely known that Russia has failed to gain aerial superiority over Ukraine, despite having a vastly larger air force. The VKS is the second largest air force in the world, according to Global Firepower, with 2,766 aircraft in a state of combat readiness. Much like we see with Russia's tanks, this would suggest Moscow is in no danger of running out of planes anytime soon. But looks can be deceiving. In a March 2024 report by RAND, the organization points out that Russia is burning through the lifespans of its fighter aircraft to the point where its total force is less than 75% of its pre-war strength. The point here is that it's not just the hundreds of planes being shot down over the skies of Ukraine that presents a problem for the VKS. It's also the overuse of old assets that were already nearing the end of their service lives. RAND's information suggests that the VKS will lose 60 aircraft to simple overuse, meaning the planes have flown beyond the flight time they were built for by the end of 2024. That's planes that aren't going to be shot down. They'll just be cycled out of the Russian inventory altogether because they can no longer be relied upon to fly. RAND also points out that Russia is only building 20 Su-30, Su-34, and Su-35s per year. This equates to it only replenishing about a third of its stock it's losing due to age. That's before you even consider the combat losses Ukraine has inflicted upon the VKS. It's also worth pointing out that a little more than half of the VKS's tactical airframes are over 30 years old. A little déjà vu might come into play here, just as with its tanks. Russia is increasingly reliant on older equipment to maintain its attacks in Ukraine. The problem the VKS has is that its planes are far more delicate than tanks in the mechanical sense. An old Soviet-era tank can keep chugging along with refurbishments and modernizations for as long as needed, assuming it isn't destroyed in combat. That's not the case for older airframes. They have a limited lifespan and become practically useless once they've reached the end of their road. RAND speculates that these lifespan issues may not affect Russia too much in Ukraine. The problem will come later. Russia will need to rebuild the VKS once the war is over. For instance, Moscow has used its older MiG-31s and Su-27s to conduct air patrols at a distance and occasionally support hypersonic missile strikes on Ukrainian territory. These older aircraft began the war with between 20% and 35% of their original airframe lives remaining, meaning they're likely going to cycle out of service long before the war ends. Where does that leave Russia in the future? The VKS will be depleted, with Russia being forced to build more and newer planes to replace the older models it's lost. That's where the sanctions issue affecting its tank production comes into play. Russia will struggle to build more planes because it can't get its hands on the materials it needs. Perhaps that's why we're seeing Moscow only requisitioning about a third of the planes it needs to replace those cycling out due to airframes hitting the end of their lifespan. Furthermore, the combined NATO forces have access to around 800 fifth-generation aircraft, and they purchase another 100 or so annually. Russia is relying on Soviet-era planes that are also going to be unable to fly, while failing to replenish the VKS with fifth-generation jets that could keep it competitive with other countries after the Ukraine war ends. And it's not just planes that present a problem to the VKS. Pilots are also an issue. That's according to Colonel Hannes Tumsalu, who's part of the reservist Estonian Defense Forces. When examining the sinking of Russia's Novichokazk warship in 2023, he pointed out that the Ukrainians apparently struck the ship with French Scalp cruise missiles launched from Su-27 jets. Given that those missiles have a range of 155 miles, Ukraine can now fire on targets from outside of Russia's aerial defense zone. But more worrying for Russia, according to Tumsalu, is the possibility that it's running out of experienced pilots. How else could you explain Russia failing to put up a defense against the missiles Ukraine used to sink the Novichokazk? Or as Tumsalu puts it, the young do not yet understand how to fight the old, experienced ones. That's an opinion shared by Yuri Inhat, a spokesperson for Ukraine's Air Force, who spoke to Pravda in May 2023 to discuss the state of the VKS. He pointed out that Russia continues to train pilots, meaning it's not going to run out of people to put in planes anytime soon. In fact, it has between 100 and 150 pilots graduating from its training schools annually. The problem for the VKS is that this plays into Ukraine's hands. Inhat says he doesn't believe the VKS will run out of pilots. However, as he states, it's obvious that the quality of the Russian personnel will diminish. Russia's early aerial losses in the war not only saw it lose equipment, it also sacrificed many pilots who had combat experience in Syria. The replacements are essentially being forced to learn on the job, coming fresh out of pilot school, only to find themselves deployed into a combat situation. Perhaps that, combined with aging airframes, is why Russia has limited the use of its VKS in the war. It's running out of good planes and quality pilots to fly them. Then there's Russia's Navy. We mentioned the loss of the Novocherkassk warship earlier, and that's far from the only ship Russia has lost during the war. The strangest thing about this situation is that Ukraine barely has a navy to speak of. Global Firepower says it has just 104 assets, with most of those being simple patrol boats that aren't effective in a naval battle. We should have seen Russia take advantage of that fact. The dreaded Black Sea Fleet should have dominated the waters that give it the name, providing Moscow with a waterborne passage into Ukraine, but that isn't what's happened. Instead, Ukraine has wreaked havoc on the Black Sea Fleet. In March 2024, Ukraine announced that it had destroyed or disabled around a third of the warships in the Black Sea Fleet since the beginning of the war. That announcement came in the wake of Ukraine scuttling the Kostiantyn-Olshansky as it rested in the docks of Sevastopol, with the strike also managing to cause damage to a pair of Russian landing ships, the Azov and Yamal. It's a story that's repeated multiple times during the conflict. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has proven ineffectual, at least compared to the impact it was expected to have. Ukraine has made clever use of missile strikes, such as the one targeted at Sevastopol, as well as unmanned maritime drones to pick away at Russia's navy. Take the sinking of the Caesar Kunikov warship as another example. In a 3-minute video released following the ship's sinking, observers watched as a small speedboat sped toward the warship. After drawing nearer, there's a huge explosion. The Caesar Kunikov is seen rolling onto its port side before sinking beneath the waves. That speedboat wasn't a boat at all, at least not in the traditional sense. It was an unmanned maritime drone called the Magura 5 that Ukraine essentially used to launch a kamikaze attack, only without a human sacrificing themselves to take out a Russian ship. That incident caused Putin to strip command from the admiral who leads the Black Sea Fleet. Russia's problem is that it now faces a new era of warfare, one in which its ships are vulnerable to unmanned attacks and missile strikes, as well as the traditional warfare of old. It's not fighting a naval battle, at least not one it can recognize, with Ukraine, and yet it's still losing many of the ships it sends into the Black Sea. Worse yet, it's struggling to replace them. That's according to Katarina Zisk, a professor of international relations and contemporary history who works with the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. She points out that Putin issued an order for a constant Russian naval presence way back in December 2013, clearing the way for the construction of special ice-class vessels that come equipped with ice-breaking capabilities to make that presence possible. Russia's shipbuilding industry presented plans, and Moscow has invested heavily in developing these vessels. Yet nothing of substance is emerging from Russia's shipyards. The LK-110, which should be Russia's next-generation nuclear-powered icebreaker, is still in its development phase. But far more worrying for Moscow is that its naval development program is stalling out, even at its earliest phases, due to the combination of economic, financial, and structural problems. Zisk explains that ineffective resources and corruption, all added to the sheer cost of developing new ships, has slowed construction to a crawl. She also points to Western sanctions as having hit Russia's shipbuilding industry hard. Those sanctions were put in place when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and have only intensified since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Zisk highlights how Russia's navy is cut off from much of the equipment it needs to build its next generation of ships, with diesel-powered units that used to come from Germany now being far harder to come by. Gas turbine engines Moscow used to buy from Ukraine have also dried up, for obvious reasons. Christian Arland, a senior researcher at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, adds to this, claiming that Russia's entire shipbuilding industry is plagued by uncertainty. Assuming that construction starts before the end of this decade, the first vessel of the class is unlikely to be completed before 2025 at the earliest, he told the Barent Observer in 2016. Time has proven him correct. Returning to the Black Sea Fleet, a May 2024 Forbes article points out that Ukraine's steady degrading of the Black Sea Fleet, it sunk 15 of the 36 warships the fleet had prior to the war, is moving at such a pace that Russian manufacturing can't keep up. It's also worth pointing out that Turkey is blocking Russia from sailing ships through the Bosporus Strait to reach the Black Sea. As such, Russia is forced to supplement its fleet with smaller ships, which are easier targets for Ukraine as it tries to build more ships in the Black Sea shipyards. those shipyards are in range of Ukraine's drones. That leaves Russia in a position where it's trying to build new missile corvettes to enter the Black Sea, all while under constant threat of Ukrainian strikes during the construction phase. And even when those corvettes enter the Black Sea, they're getting sunk so fast that Moscow can't keep up. After all, you only have to look at what happened to the Cyclone, a Russian missile corvette that entered the Black Sea in July 2023. Just 10 months after entering service, that ship is now resting on the sea floor, a victim of a Ukrainian strike on Sevastopol. People, planes, ships, tanks, armored vehicles, Russia is gradually whittling down its supplies of all of them, forcing it to rely on outdated Soviet-era technology to continue its war against Ukraine. And those aren't its only problems. Even on the basic equipment level, Russia is struggling to provide for its troops on the ground. Numerous reports during the war suggest that Russia often sends troops into battle without even the most basic equipment they need to put up a fight. A January 2023 report published in Radio Free Europe offers one example. It reported on a video published on Telegram that appeared to show a little over 20 men standing in masks and camouflage gear, appealing for help. The video revealed those men were Russian soldiers, and their message was simple: "Please help us sort out our situation." In the video, one of the men says, "Our commander gave us an order not to retreat from our positions, but the commander gave us no cover and no support. We had only machine guns and all the rest of the weapons were damaged." That video highlighted the constant equipment issues Russia seems to have had in the Ukraine war. Other reports suggest Russian troops have received rations that are 7 years out of date. Again, that reliance on old equipment coming into play. And if more recent reports are to be believed, Russia faces extreme challenges in finding new equipment and materials to continue the war. That's according to a February 2024 article published by the BBC, which quoted a Western official who says that Russia's domestic ammunition production capabilities are currently insufficient for meeting the needs of the Ukraine conflict. The official goes on to claim that sanctions have hit Russia so hard that it's been forced to look for alternative means of supply, such as buying equipment from other countries to keep its war effort going, or requisitioning equipment that it's meant to be sending to other countries. The BBC reports that Russia did exactly that to India, keeping hold of equipment it was meant to be sending for use in the war. Perhaps that partially explains why India is now increasingly buying from Western suppliers. Russia's supply is drying up, and it can't get the weapons it needs from Moscow anymore. There's also Russia's artillery problem. Forbes estimates that Russia has around 2,000 howitzers stationed across the 600-mile front in Ukraine, with those howitzers firing a combined 10,000 shells daily. That comes out to around 5 shells per day, though it's likely more for the artillery that's stationed in the most critical areas of the front lines. Even at 5 rounds per day, that means the average Russian artillery barrel will last for about a year before its steel becomes too brittle. Those barrels need replacing. So Russia finds itself in a similar position as it does with so much of its equipment. Not only is it losing artillery by the shed load, one report suggests it lost 1,143 pieces to Ukraine since the war began, but the artillery it still has is degrading. That's led to Russia pulling thousands of Cold War-era towed howitzers out of storage. Those howitzers aren't being sent to the front lines. Instead, they're having their barrels stripped and repurposed to replace the worn-out barrels on Russia's current howitzers. Again, we see Russia burning through its old supplies instead of manufacturing new barrels, perhaps yet another effect of the sanctions placed against it. All of this leads us to a final question. Does Russia have enough equipment to see out the Ukraine war? The odds are that it does, assuming the war ends in the next year or two. But the more worrying thing for Russia is the state in which its military will be when the war ends. Will it still be seen as one of the world's dominant military powers, or will its army be so depleted, with sanctions making it more difficult to recover, that it'll essentially run out of what it needs to be considered a powerful nation by the war's end? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia's navy is in serious trouble, or click this other video instead.